10 Top of African Weakness Military. Diesen, Burkina Faso. Founding Contours. Origins. The Armed Forces of Burkina Faso were formed following independence from France in 1960, then the Republic of Upper Volta. They evolved from colonial security units and were periodically reorganized through successive governments. Historical background. Burkina Faso's military has been politically active throughout its post-colonial history, including coups and popular revolutions, e.g., Thomas Sankara's 1983 revolution. Since the 2010s, Burkina Faso has faced a severe insurgency largely connected to Sahelian jihadist groups. The worsening security environment has prompted multiple coups, reconfigurations of command, and heavy operational demands on the military. The strain of continuous counterinsurgency operations, losses and budget limits have affected morale, readiness and professional capacity. Current status and issues. The armed forces are heavily engaged in internal counterterrorism and territorial defense across the country, but capability gaps, particularly in air surveillance, logistics and secure communications, reduce effectiveness. Frequent political changes complicate long-term modernization and civilian oversight. Douvi, Senegal. Founding us origins. Senegal's armed forces trace their formal reorganization to independence in 1960, with many officers and structures shaped by French military doctrine and training inherited from colonial times. Historical background. Post-independence. Senegal maintained a relatively stable civil-military relationship compared with many neighbors. The country contributed to UN peacekeeping missions and retained French defense cooperation for decades. Recently, 2024-25, political shifts and a new administration, pursuing greater sovereignty, led to major changes in defense posture and ended France's permanent troop presence in 2025. A significant development for Senegal's force, posture and regional security. Cooperation. Current status and issues. Senegal historically had a moderately capable professional force for regional standards, but still modest relative to larger African militaries. Recent French withdrawals and policy changes push Senegal toward greater self-reliance and new partnerships, which will reshape capabilities and training pipelines. Oitu, Mauritania. Founding us origins. Mauritania's national armed forces, developed after independence from France in 1960, initially inheriting a small set of colonial-era structures and expanding to face desert and border security needs. Historical background. Mauritania's forces were shaped by the country's harsh desert geography and by regional conflicts such as the Western Sahara War, 1970s-80s, during which France, Argentina in the 1970s, later China and others, and the air-ground components were configured largely for patrolling, counterinsurgency and border protection. Current status and issues. Key challenges are operating across vast desert areas. Sete, Gabon. Founding us origins. The Gabonese armed forces were created shortly after independence. The modern formation date commonly cited is 6 December 1960, when President Léon Mba issued decrees organizing national units from former colonial, non-commissioned officers. Historical background. Following independence, August 1960, Gabon maintained relatively close defense ties with France, receiving training, equipment, and technical assistance. The Gabonese military has been small but politically significant at times. Coups and attempted coups in some post-independence periods highlighted the military's role in domestic politics. Gabon's resource wealth produced the means for limited modernization, but overall force size stayed modest. Current status and issues. Gabon's military is compact, oriented toward regime security, border control, and limited regional operations. It relies on external partnerships for advanced capabilities and training. 6. Madagascar. Founding Kapre Witiye. Origins. Madagascar's armed forces evolved from pre-colonial Marina Kingdom armies and later colonial-era units. As a modern national force, they were reorganized after independence from France in 1960. Historical background. Madagascar's military history includes the powerful Marina Kingdom of the 19th century that centralized military institutions before French colonization, late 19th century. Under French rule, Malagasy units served in both world wars. Independence in 1960 initiated the creation of national land, naval and air components. Madagascar has experienced several coups and periods of political crisis, e.g. 2002-2009, during which the role of the military in internal politics has been notable, but not overtly expansionist. Economic constraints have limited the scope of modernization. Current status and issues. Madagascar's forces remain modestly sized and primarily oriented to internal security, maritime patrol, disaster response, and border control. Geography. A large island with difficult terrain, plus limited defense spending produce capability gaps in surveillance. Transport and naval assets. Tank. Liberia. Founding as origins. The modern armed forces of Liberia trace their roots to the Liberian Frontier Force, LFF. Established 6 February 1908. The LFF later evolved into today's AFL after several reorganizations, including in 1962-1970. Historical background. Liberia's early 20th century Frontier Force was designed to police hinterland borders and assert state authority. For much of the 20th century, the military served a domestic security role under civilian governments. Liberia's military and police institutions were severely destabilized by two civil wars, 1989-1996, 1999-2003, that devastated the country and led to international interventions, security and disaster response. It continues to rely on foreign training and advisory assistance, and limited budgets and institutional capacity constrain force expansion. 4. Sierra Leone, founding Copatecutia. Origins. Sierra Leone's modern armed forces were formalized at independence in 1961, inheriting elements of the British Royal West African Frontier Force and colonial policing units. Historical background. The Sierra Leone Armed Forces served internal security and border roles after independence. The country endured a brutal civil war, 1991-2002, in which state institutions, including the military, fractured and were implicated in abuses. Post-war reforms, with international assistance, focused on demobilization, disarmament, reintegration of ex-combatants, and professionalization of the armed forces and police. The 2000s and 2010s saw rebuilding efforts to restore civilian oversight and retrain the military. Current status and issues. Sierra Leone's military remains small, with limited logistics and equipment. Its main roles are internal security, border control, and contribution to regional peacekeeping when feasible. Persistent development. Constraints and budgets keep the force limited in size and reach. 3. Somalia. Founding and origins. The Somali National Army, SNA, celebrates 12th April 1960 as its formal origin, merging police and former colonial units around the time of British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland independence and union in 1960. The wider Somali armed forces include the Army, Navy, and air components that grew out of colonial policing and gendarmerie elements. Historical background. Post-independence. Somalia initially built a conventional force, expanded in the 1960s-70s, with foreign assistance, notably the Soviet Union during parts of the Cold War. The Somali state collapsed after the 1991 overthrow of Siad Barre, triggering a protracted civil war and the near disintegration of national armed forces. Since the 2000s, Somali security has been dominated by a mix of reconstituted national forces, regional militias, and Islamist insurgent groups, most prominently Al-Shabaab. International and regional missions, training programs, and AMISOM/ATMIS operations helped rebuild parts of the security apparatus. But force capacity remains uneven. Current status and issues. The SNA is being reconstructed with significant international assistance, but it still faces challenges: shortage of trained personnel, equipment deficits, limited air and naval capability, and persistent asymmetrical threats from insurgents. Control over territory is contested, and many areas depend on local militias or international forces for security. 2. Central African Republic, CAR. Founding, origins. The armed forces of the Central African Republic grew out of colonial-era forces and were institutionalized after independence from France in 1960. The country's military institution has often been central to political power since independence. Historical background. Since 1960, the CAR has experienced repeated coups, military regimes, and chronic instability. The military has frequently played a dominant political role. Several presidents and coup leaders emerged from army ranks. From the 2000s onward, the CAR faced large-scale internal armed conflict, including the 2004 Bush War and the 2012-2014 crisis that produced the Seleka Rebellion and communal violence. International peacekeeping missions, African Union and UN MINUSCA, have been heavily involved. Rebuilding coherent national defense structures has been difficult because paramilitary groups, foreign mercenaries, and lightly armed Militias fragment the country's security landscape. Current status and issues. CAR's armed forces are hampered by weak command and control, poor logistics, low pay, and fragmentation. International partners provide training and support, but the state's monopoly on force remains contested in many regions. 1. Benin, Republic of Benin, founding as origins. Benin's modern armed forces trace their institutional roots to the post-colonial period after independence, from France in 1960, when the new Republic of Dahomey, renamed Benin in 1975, inherited small colonial security units and later reorganized them into national military services. Historical background. Under French colonial rule, the territory relied on colonial troops. At independence, August 1, 1960, the new state created modest land and internal security forces rather than a large expeditionary military. Through the 1960s-1980s, Benin's military sometimes intervened. In politics, several coups and military governments occurred across West Africa in that era, and the country oscillated between military influence and civilian rule. Economic constraints during the 1980s and 1990s led to small force size, limited training and aging equipment. Democratic reforms in the 1990s reduced the military's political role and emphasized professionalization. Current status and issues. Benin is ranked among African states with relatively low military power metrics due to small manpower, limited defense budgets, modest equipment inventories, and reliance on regional cooperation for security. Priority problems are funding, logistics and securing, porous borders against trafficking and cross-border insurgent movements,